Thinking about this episode for a long time. They're easily the biggest band ever. After they broke up officially in 1970, the world hoped for a day that they would reunite, but it seemed impossible. Yet following a decade of solo careers, there were behind-the-scenes talks of a reunion. It was going to happen. However, these plans were tragically cut short when one of these four men was taken from this earth. One of the darkest days in rock history. But then years later, thanks to a near-forgotten demo tape, a reunion became a reality, as much as it could be. The surviving band members used this demo to record 2 new songs. They also meant to do a 3rd track, but the quality of the cassette was so poor, they couldn't finish it. Today, we relive the history of all 3 songs, including the new one. It's taken a band that has been broken up for over 50 years back to the top of the charts. Stories coming up on Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies. Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time, especially today. You know, if you remember making your Christmas list using the Sears catalog, you're going to dig this channel of deep musical nostalgia. Make sure to subscribe below right now. Click the bell, click the big red button so you always know when our stuff's coming out. Daily rock history lesson. We also have a Patreon. You're going to want to check that out. There's an additional catalog of exclusive content there that helps us to keep it a daily channel. You can also become an honorary producer. So for today's episode, we're doing something a little out of the ordinary. We're going to cover 3 tracks written and recorded by a phenomenal band decades after they broke up. But even though they were able to come together for these tracks, they never technically reunited. It's the in-depth story of a trifecta of post-Beatles breakup Beatles tracks. Talking about Free as a Bird, Real Love, and Now and Then. For years following the breakup of the Beatles, there was understandably intense public interest in the careers and activities of each individual Beatle. Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and of course John Lennon. And underlying that preoccupation with the former band was the impossible hope that somehow, some way, the Fab Four would get back together again. Throughout the 70s, each solo Beatle would make their mark on music history, for sure. Paul on his own and with Wings, he was the most prolific. He released 9 studio albums, something like 25 US top 40 singles, which included 6 #1 hits. And George, for his part, he released 6 studio albums, masterpieces. He garnered 10 top 40 singles. My Lord. Ringo dropped 7 studio albums and he scored 10 top 40 singles. And John Lennon issued 6 studio albums in the 70s, scoring 8 top 40 singles before stepping back from the spotlight to raise his newborn son, Sean. Then in 1980, John returned to the music industry with his multi-platinum masterpiece, Double Fantasy. But then, as we all know, John was tragically gunned down and murdered on December 8th, 1980. Just a few weeks after that album's release, it would go to #1.
Lennon was shot and killed at about 11 o'clock last night outside his apartment building.
John Lennon's murder, it sent a shockwave across the world. And outside of the sheer sadness of this event, John's death, it also officially marked the end of an era. I mean, up to that point, the breakup of the Beatles could always be undone. A reunion was always technically a possibility. But when John Lennon passed away, when he died, so did any and all hope that the Beatles would come together again. It was really over. Throughout the 80s, the 3 surviving Beatles continued growing their solo careers. Paul McCartney released another 7 albums, and he collaborated with the likes of Michael Jackson and Stevie Wonder and David Gilmour and Elvis Costello and so many others. Say what you want, but don't. Harrison and Starr They each continued their solo output as well, releasing 5 albums between them, including Harrison's big comeback in '88, Cloud 9. Notably, though, by the end of the decade, both would take part in big-name collaborations, i.e. the Traveling Wilburys and, of course, Ringo Starr and his all-star band, still going strong. Then at the dawn of the 90s, Paul, George, and Ringo, they would come together for a legendary multimedia project, talking about the documentary miniseries, The Beatles Anthology, a project that had actually originated 2 decades earlier, in 1971, when Apple Corp's executive Neil Aspinall set out to work on a 90-minute Beatles documentary, tentatively titled The Long and Winding Road. Aspinall, he stockpiled concert footage and television appearances and interviews with the band. It was going to be big. However, the project would lay dormant for years, and the Beatles didn't actually get involved until around 1980. This is when they secretly began planning a reunion concert. That's right, a lot of people don't know this. The background for The Long and Winding Road went public in 1980 in a legal deposition connected to the Beatles' lawsuit against the Beatlemania musical. In it, Lennon confirmed that he and his former bandmates were planning a concert in New York Central Park. Can you even imagine? It would have been the biggest ever. This performance would have actually been the documentary's finale. Later, Yoko Ono said that just days before his death, John was making plans to go to England for a triumphant Beatles reunion. She said his greatest dream was to recreate the musical magic of the early years with Paul, George, and Ringo. He felt that they had traveled different paths for long enough. He felt that they had grown up and were mature enough to try writing and recording new songs. End of quote. Wow. I mean, can you imagine what would have been? Tragically, Lennon's murder put an end to all those dreams. And The Long and Winding Road, that documentary, was shelved until it was resurrected for the Beatles Anthology in 1990, with Paul, George, and Ringo all directly involved. Now, the documentary took about 5 years to complete and included all new interviews with the surviving members by Jools Holland. And for John, archival interviews were used as well, so you had all of them. The anthology miniseries consisted of 6 hours of footage and premiered on ITV television in the UK and ABC in America in November of '95. ABC aired the series in 3 2-hour installments on November 19th, 22nd, and 23rd. The project also featured nearly 6 hours of audio material, which became the basis for 3 volumes of multi-disc anthology albums. Of course, the Beatles Anthology, Volume 1, aka Anthology 1, that was released in November of '95, and it consisted of studio outtakes, rare recordings, and live performances from the bandmates' very early years, actually between 1958 and 1964. Anthology 2, that came out in March of '96. It contains similar types of material from '65 to '68. And then the final entry in the trilogy, Anthology 3, was released in October of '96 and ranged from 1968 through their last photo session that happened in August of '69. The contents of Anthology 3 brought the Beatles' career to a close with the recordings for the Get Back project through the Abbey Road sessions. One day we'll have to do a video on each of the anthologies and go through that. Let me know if you'd like to see that below. The anthology included the first new Beatles songs in decades. In the early 90s, George Harrison and Neil Aspinall approached Yoko Ono about enhancing John's Dakota-era demos to include in the anthology. It was all planned. Later in January of 1994, after McCartney delivered Lennon's induction speech at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Yoko Ono gave him the demos, which included what would become 3 iconic post-Beatles collaborations: Free as a Bird, Real Love, and Now and Then.
Friend Paul, John Lennon, you made it. Tonight you're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
All 3 surviving Beatles, they would weigh in on the idea. Paul said, and I quote, "When we lost John, we knew that it was really over. But in 1994, amazingly, an opportunity arose where we could make more music together." Ringo would say, We could use John and try to make a record. It was the closest thing we'll ever come to having him back in the room. And then George said, to hear John's voice, that's a thing we should cherish. And I'm sure he would have really enjoyed that opportunity to be with us again. End of quote. No doubt about it. To produce this monumental project, they initially and fittingly considered George Martin. Of course they would have to. However, the aging producer declined due to hearing problems. So the Threedles, as they were then called, turned to ELO's Jeff Lynne, one of my favorites. Jeff had previously produced Harrison's Cloud 9 record and had partnered with George in the Traveling Wilburys. There was already a relationship there, a strong one. Written by John Lennon, Free as a Bird became the much-publicized centerpiece of the Beatles Anthology Volume 1. This was composed in 1977 at his home in New York City's Dakota apartment building. Lennon recorded a demo of the song with vocal and piano accompaniment. It was recorded on a single mic. So to rework the demo, McCartney, Harrison, and Starr, they gathered at Paul's Hog Hill Mill studio in Sussex. This was in February 95. There they recorded additional vocals and instrumentation around Lennon's basic track. Now, as we break down these songs, all of them, I want to thank our sponsor, Zenni Eyewear, the glasses I always wear. Make sure to click on our info button right up here to discover Zenni's newest line of glasses. You design them, see how you look before you buy. You can get to 80% off regular retail prices. Click here today or below. So for Jeff Lynne, even just the idea of producing songs for the Beatles was really quite scary, as he would say, especially since Jeff didn't know Paul McCartney very well. Two had only met a couple of times. According to Lynne, Paul was initially concerned the project would be a one-side affair, since Jeff and George were already friends. But Jeff said Paul needn't have worried because he was totally into the spirit of things. Ringo would add, we really got to know Jeff on Free as a Bird, and he was a lifesaver on that song. He put that cassette together and has all of us play. It was interesting because the three of us felt really comfortable with him. And Free as a Bird would become one of only a few songs credited to all four Beatles as composers. Paul would go on to say that they kept John in mind through the entire process. His voice was always in their ears, and they just played along. Gradually adding a bit of bass and some guitar here and there. Recording the song, it was difficult, in part because the tape was, as Paul would say, a crackly old thing. It was filled with hiss and unwanted noise. But also because John's voice and the piano were just impossible to separate. But said Jeff Lynne about it, we got it done somehow. It came out really good in the end. Paul even came and gave Jeff this huge bear hug when it was finished, and he said, well done, you've done it. Released 2.5 decades after their disbandment, Free as a Bird premiered on BBC Radio 1 on November 20th, 1995. It was sent to U.S. radio stations the very next day. The single sold 120,000 copies in its first week alone, entering the UK singles chart at number 2. In the U.S., Free as a Bird reached number 6 on the Hot 100, making it the Beatles' 34th top 10 single in America. Internationally, the song broke the top 10 around the world. It went to number 10 in Spain, went to number 9 in the Netherlands, number 7 in Canada, number 6 in Australia, number 5 in Italy, and Iceland, number 4 in Denmark, and it went to number 3 in Sweden. But Free as a Bird wasn't the only new song to come out of this project. Real Love headlined the second anthology, if you remember. Like Free as a Bird, Real Love was composed by Lennon at home in New York. This happened reportedly between 1979 and 1980. Lennon recorded 6 takes of the demo with vocal and piano or acoustic guitar accompaniment. That was recorded into a cassette player. It's real love. It's real. Like Free as a Bird, Jeff Lynne had to overcome an excessive amount of hiss on the source tape, the original tape. To Lynne's ears, it sounded like it had been copied multiple times. There's also a hum and clicks all through the track, so it was very tough. To remedy this, Jeff Lynne pioneered a new noise reduction system. They spent a day working on it, only to listen back and find loads of other things wrong with it. The good news is that John's voice, it was totally unaffected. So they were just dealing with the air in between phrases. So apparently it took about a week to clean it up before the demo was usable. As Jeff Lynne would say, putting fresh music to it, that was the easy part. Real Love was another hit for the Beatles, though not without some controversy. In March of '96, BBC's Popular Radio 1 purposely excluded Real Love from the station's playlist. They said that listeners didn't want to hear the song because it wasn't contemporary. In a press release, Beatles spokesman Jeff Baker reported the band's response as indignation, shock, and surprise. We all were. And on March 9th, 1996, McCartney published a retort in the Daily Mirror writing, "The Beatles don't need our new single Real Love to be a hit. It's not as if our careers depend on it. If Radio 1 feels that we should be banned now, it's not exactly going to ruin us overnight." Of course, Real Love did just fine. It's the Beatles. UK radio band or not, it went to number 4, and here in the States it peaked at number 11 on the Hot 100 and number 10 on the Cashbox chart. Elsewhere, Real Love went to number 8 in Denmark, Ireland, and Hungary, number 6 in Italy and Australia, number 4 in Finland, and number 2 in the Czech Republic and Sweden. In contrast to Anthologies 1 and 2, Anthology 3, it didn't feature any new tracks, though not for a lack of trying. This is where a third Lennon demo called Now and Then. That was meant to headline Volume 3, actually. It was dropped from the project, in part because of impossible technological challenges related to John Lennon's voice. The demo sound quality, it suffered from a persistent hum that Jeff Lynne was just not able to work around. Plus, according to Paul, they couldn't separate John's voice from the piano. Of course, in the new recent Now and Then mini documentary, Paul elaborated on that. He said, "On John's demo tape, the piano was a little hard to hear, and in those days, we just didn't have the technology to do the separation. Every time I wanted a little bit more of John's voice, this piano came through and clouded the picture. I think we kind of ran out of steam a bit and time, and it was like, well, I don't know, maybe we'll leave this one." End of quote. You got to check out the documentary on Now and Then. I'll link to it below. Now and Then just kind of languished in a cupboard. Apparently, George got burned out on the track as well. He called it rubbish. After the anthology was released, Paul said of Now and Then, "That one is still lingering around somewhere. I'm going to nick George with Jeff and finish it one of these days." Unfortunately, little did Paul or any of us know that George Harrison would pass away on November 29th, 2001. The Threedles were down to 2. And we were in for another decades-long span of Beatles radio silence. However, the release of Peter Jackson's The Beatles Get Back in 2021 would change all of that. Get back, George! The latest Beatles documentary, it paved the way for a renewed look at Now and Then. Actually, a software system developed by Jackson's team for Get Back's production finally allowed for John's vocals to be separated from that piano part. Said Peter Jackson about it, "During the course of Get Back, we were paying a lot of attention to the technical restoration. That ultimately led us to develop a technology which allows us to take any soundtrack and split all the different components into separate tracks based on machine learning. With the tech now available, the time had finally come to finish this long overdue project." If we must start again. And amazingly, for a song that waited decades for the right technology, it only took a matter of moments to separate John's voice from the track. Now they could mix the song and make a proper record of it. Now and then. As Paul listened to it, he thought, oh, I could actually do the bass a bit better, so why don't I start there? Then he called Ringo and asked him if he'd like to lay down the drums. They commissioned a string section to flesh out the track, and then keeping George's guitar parts from 95, they added a slide guitar solo in George's style. Sounds brilliant. Of course, as a tribute to their fallen friend. Though not all all physically present, Now and Then marks the completion of the last recording that John, Paul, George, and Ringo will get to make together, concluding the songwriting legacy of the most influential band in popular music history. Not just rock history, pop music. When contemplating whether even to do the track back when it was Paul, George, and Ringo, Paul said that he asked himself, is this something we should do? But then he responded, wait a minute. Let's say I had a chance to ask John, hey John, would you like us to finish this last song of yours? I'm telling you, I know the answer would have been, yeah. He would have loved that. End of quote. So in its first week, Now and Then was released to the public, and it's racked up almost 30 million views on YouTube alone. And since then, it's killed it on the charts. It's gone to #1 in the UK for starters. Here in the US, it's hit #1 on the Billboard Digital Song Sales chart. Also #11 on the Hot Rock and Alternative chart. Elsewhere, it climbed to #8 in Sweden, #6 in Australia, #5 in the Netherlands, #4 in Ireland and Japan, and #1 in Germany. So I gotta ask you, be honest, how many of you cried a bit when you first heard this song? I definitely did. It's just so poignant when all four Beatles sing, Now and Then, I Miss You. We know exactly what they mean. I miss you. I had a good cry. I thought about my dad, of course, who introduced me to the music of the Beatles. That started me on this journey so long ago. I just felt his presence there when I first listened to it. I don't know how to describe it. In an era when we're watching the essence of rock and roll, great music die before our very eyes, it's moments like this one that truly give us hope that rock and roll is going to live forever. After all, it's now been over 50 years since John, Paul, George, and Ringo all went their separate ways. And here we are, Beatlemania once again alive and well as ever. And I gotta tell you, this is the perfect swan song for the lads, the Fab Four, that really invented what we know as rock and roll, classic rock. The first band that lit the flame. I mean, when the Beatles came to America and played the Ed Sullivan Show in early 1964. You think about it, our nation had just lost our president, John F. Kennedy, assassinated. We were in deep mourning. The Fab Four, they lifted the world out of the doldrums. And the very next day, scores of rock bands formed everywhere. I mean, every major rock band that came out of the next few decades would point to the Beatles as the main instigator. And now here we are again, a nation in mourning, divided by everything you can think of, from political parties to two horrendous wars. Yet there is one thing that will always unite us, music. To John, Paul, George, and Ringo, I say, perfect timing. Thanks so much for watching. Leave us a comment about the Beatles and these three songs. Which one do you think, what's your favorite of the three? Now and Then, it's just so poignant. Tell us what you first felt when you first heard it, what you thought of. Let's have a great discussion below. If you like our content, we do invite you to subscribe. We'd love to have you as part of our content. Until next time, truly, 3 chords and the truth, my friend.